they kind of agreed that this is more, gives a more intellectual, more explanatory power to use the protest publics concept. And so we studied Russia, India, and Bangladesh, and Turkey, Macedonia, Brazil, Ireland, Italy, United Kingdom, Tunisia, Egypt, and Morocco. So again, the broad view of all different countries that recently have experienced the protest publics activity. Another field of research is another study group of students of department, an internal grant that was won by the application of Caroline Шлауфер, who is the leader of the project, that is on narratives. And the narrative policy framework is a concept developed in the West, studying countries of developed democracies. This basically focuses on the narrative, the stories that people tell, in which they express their attitude to existing events. And this is not always, but in most cases, it is contested between the representatives of civil society, the citizens, and the government. So the goal of that project was to analyze the narratives that is going on in Moscow. And we selected the three fields and the three debates that's going on the waste management, on the renovation program, and on transport. And going beyond the pure narratives that Open Public and the government of Moscow, representatives of government of Moscow have pronounced that we have measured the level of intensity, and the transport conflict is quite low, intensivity of contestation. For renovation, the conflict is both high and low, dependent on where the citizen, the residents of the old Khrushchevka who is being demolished, how much they like the area in which they stay and they don't want to move it. So it's both conflict low and high cases. And the waste management, this is the highest conflict, because you see on the picture how many people protest against incineration measures of making the suburbs of Moscow and the cities far from Moscow is becoming making of them like a garbage can. So let's move on to another research project. It is by the general program of Wishka that is called Rediscovering the Russia. And we had an expedition there to city of Vladimir, where we discovered a protest public against the leader of the Central Museum, who wanted to commercialize that. And the protest public, in the name of Friends of the Museum, wanted to change this director, and they were lobbying actively to change him. And after the change was made, that the new director was put on, and that also was not satisfying that protest public, so that they reassembled again and start lobbying for the new policies that this new director should do, as opened and welcoming, and the working with children, and the decommercialized certain activities that the museum was offering. So moving to international relations, because I know everyone is interested, how can they build an international career? And we have the partner universities as Alma Mater Studiorum Università di Bologna from about 2002. So it's a long-term partnership which students can use for their internships. And that is very helpful for them after knowing languages to make up their dream work. Another partner is Sciences Po Lyon, and then University of Torino and University College of Torino, and University of Lugano. Another partner is University of University of Sarajevo, which is a part of Global Classroom initiative, which is organized by the European Commission. It is funded by European Commission, and we, the High School of Economics and Department of Public Policy, are a part to this project. So then let me speak about the students. So our students is really our pride, because they're coming from everywhere, but they're also coming with their passions, with their ideas, and they want to go beyond that formal schedule. So Raquel Martinez Sanchez, Carla Rodriguez, Andrea Doherty, all represented different countries like Mexico, and Andrea is from Australia. We have 2 Africans, Emmanuel Makiong and Jibril Richter, and we have Masha Mahmoudova, who is one of the leaders, one of the key recognized leaders of the activities of Student Council. We have a different model of Student Council. It's not like they are directly elected. These are the people who just show their activity, interests, and they work together on the joint projects. And as we have many students from Africa, we have designed something called Africa Day. And it is not only national costumes and food and national kind of culture, but it is also connected to the studies. So it's the panel usually done with also representation from several African states, diplomats and missions and embassies in Moscow, who will talk about their countries, about their country's development, contribution to resolution of global problems. And they usually discuss how Africa may contribute to the global stability, peace, and sustainable growth. So that's the quick discovery of the House Students Initiative and a work. They have a Human Rights Week where their debates are about students' interests in rights of disabled people, rights of women, and freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and LGBT rights. So it's a major event that many students participate beyond public policy department, and it's totally organized by students themselves. Professors are only invited to be speakers, so we're also proud of that. So let me move on to the final stage, is discovering of what is the portfolio, or how could you get in the program. So let me begin. So here you see the portfolio documents and evaluation criteria and the points, how many points you get on your documents on the portfolio, how many points you get. So let me begin with number 5, which is written documents, your publications, because this is what we value the most, that you can express your thoughts in writing, and that you have some published materials. Or if you don't have one, you can, and even if you have one, add up your bachelor work so that we can see how well you write. And second point I want to pay your attention is motivation letter, because it's extremely interesting and important parameter to show your attitude of how you want to use all of the knowledge and experience you had already, and that this is have to be written in English. And we also check the level of language that you master, because we do not have a special exam in English. We also only have that motivation letter written in English and the interview. So focusing on interview, it's the biggest number of points, 30 points you get, because there's not an exam, it's a real discussion on how you understand the current events in Russia and abroad. What are your interests? We will discuss your motivation letter and some of them, points of your CV and achievements and results in competition. So this is it. I want to be very brief because we have more people I want to give the word, and we even have a film. If we have time, we can show you the film that the students created, discussing of their plans and interests. And I want to welcome you to join a public policy department in the program of political analysis and public policy, and that's how you will look in 2 years when you've been graduating. So I want to stop here and invite our graduates to present. So I'm kind of closing this and asking if Fyodor Alexeyenkov is with us. So I see Fyodor. So introduce yourself and your work in which you work.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for this invitation, Professor Beleva. By the way, glad to hear that Moscow transportation is a low conflict. Let it be so. My name is Fedor Alexenkov. I graduated from this program in 2018, and I'm currently working as a project manager at the Moscow Government Department of Transportation. And first of all, let me tell you about my background. I'm from Novosibirsk, where I graduated from Novosibirsk State University. And I was always interested in research of political science and governance, and something about, let's say, bad governance and good governance. And after my graduation, I was looking for an interdisciplinary master program and focused on governance and public policy. That is why, after a while, I've chosen this master program here at HSE. And one of the areas I was interested in was urban development. And during my master study, I found a part-time job at Ilya Varlamov and Maxim Katz urban projects organizations, where we were doing some urban research for my street program. I'm sure everyone knows what is My Street, but just in case, it's a large-scale program of Moscow streets reconstruction and improvement. And I would like also to mention that during the study, I've got an opportunity to be an intern at Moscow Carnegie Center, one of the best think tanks in Russia. And the internship is an integral part of this program. And it's a wonderful way to get some experience in public policy centers and other organizations. And shortly before my master program graduation, I joined Moscow Transportation Department team, and I'm responsible for the creation of transportation plans for My Street program. Transportation plan is a key part of the reconstruction project because the whole reconstruction is based on it. It's a plan with all like transportation flows, directions, bus stop locations, and crosswalks, traffic lights, and many other things. And working on transportation plans, we focus on, first of all, road security. It's our first priority because it's one of the key KPIs of our organizations, and we all understand that security is important. And for road safety, we using narrowing the traffic lines, creation new crosswalks with pedestrian islands. We install new traffic lights and construction.
Further, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have 4 more speakers to speak. So I suggest that the students and the prospective students write down the questions that they can ask to you later.
Sure.
And we're coming from government organization to non-governmental organization to be represented by Ekaterina Uzoikina. Katya, you with us?
Yes, hello to everyone. Yes, thank you. I'm really happy to be part of this winter school, and thank you one more time for the invitation. Well, I would like to start from the thing that I was in your position when choosing the masters. I also participated in a winter school for prospective students, and I felt like I wanted to study something that will help to solve the challenges of the 21st century, and that's why I chose public policy. I guess that it was just right for that purpose. And just to be brief, I would like to emphasize several most important, from my point of view, advantages of the program first. So interactive process. Before I studied at Moscow State University, and there were many lectures, and there was huge distance between the professors and students. Here at HSC, it was totally different. The study process is very interactive. There are lots of presentations, workshops, advocacy campaigns, debates, simulation games. To be honest, I didn't know what was a case study or SWOT analysis before I started to study public policy. And I still remember one of my favorite classes, conflict with management, and also large corporations and social corporate responsibility. Secondly, extracurricular activities. I was a teaching assistant. I participated in the student council, volunteered at international conferences, participated at summer and winter schools, and all that helped me as well to get an increased state academic scholarship for my research and creative achievements. Thirdly, international atmosphere and international exchange opportunities. It has been already mentioned, of course, the program is in English and it brings together people from all over the world. So here you feel like a global citizen. It's the first time like I felt that way at the program. And moreover, you have the opportunity to study abroad. I'm honored to say that I was the student of one of the oldest universities, the University of Bologna, and it was an experience of a lifetime for me. And the last but not the least is people. The program brings together extraordinary people with unique experiences and unique backgrounds. And here I met people, friends who share the same values as me. As for my career, I need to say that first, after graduation, I got an offer from the expert center under Business Ombudsman of the Russian Federation. As you may know, in Russia, state interferes a lot into business processes, and what we were doing, analyzing the problems that business face nowadays, and we're preparing together with government, public representatives, experts. We were preparing solutions, sending them to the ministries, and some of the initiatives were finally heard by the government. But as I was more interested in the international development later, I was invited to work in the international department of Business Russia. What is Business Russia? It's an independent non-profit organization representing interests of small and medium-sized businesses. The aim of the organization where I'm currently working is to dialogue to form a favorable business environment and to support different business and social initiatives to develop our country. Of course, the organization is incorporated into the Russian policy-making process and elaborates proposals on different aspects of social and economic policies. But as I'm head of international projects at Business Russia, I'm mostly working and advocating the interests of our business abroad. I would like to introduce here a new term to you, business diplomacy. It's now developing a lot. It's when multinational companies have to manage complex interactions with foreign governments, with international NGOs, and that's what we are doing here. So, for instance, during the pandemic, I was providing consultations to the companies who wanted to supply medical equipment to the developed countries, assisted in participating in the United Nations tenders, and so on. We also help businessmen to participate in business councils of such international organizations as BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Eurasian Economic Union, and so on. Of course,
I hate to interrupt you, but you need to kind of shorten it up for making enough time for the others. Just could you please formulate the conclusion?
Yes, just to sum it up, I need to say that I learned from the public policy program such important skills as the ability to analyze the complex issues and also the ability to present, negotiate, and persuade, what is important nowadays. And of course, the public policy gave me the understanding of the global perspective of things that helps me not only at my work, but in day-to-day life. So that's, in short, I would be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Katerina. So let's move on to the new organization, which is international non-governmental organization, and that we have Peter Pantyushkin in there. Peter, you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you, Professor Bilayeva. So, hello, everybody. My name is Peter Pantyushkin. I work at the Doctors Without Borders. This is the international humanitarian medical nonprofit organization. And I guess that probably some of you have heard about that, but I'm going to tell you like pretty brief about that. We are the humanitarian organization that delivers emergency emergency aid to the people affected by armed conflict, by epidemics, by pandemics, natural disasters, and exclusion from healthcare. And we do so irrespective of race, religion, political views, gender, and all that stuff that can be used for discrimination. So we are neutral and independent. Basically, I'm gonna talk very brief about my background. I used to be the teacher of English, but in year 2013, 2014, I got very interested in the topic of protests like Maidan and the unrecognized states, just so-called DPR and LPR in the east of Ukraine. So I got very interested in this topic, and I decided that I need to develop in this sphere to work somewhere close to the international affairs or international organizations. And luckily, I have found the program, which is called Political Analysis Public Policy, and I managed to enter the program via the Olympiada. So in my case, it was an easy way. And in 2016, I joined the program. I can say that it was very difficult for me in the very beginning because I used to be the teacher of English, and bam, right now I have to study the political sciences. And the first semester was pretty hard because the program was very full with different courses and disciplines. So I had to study a lot. But the second semester went quite better and quite easier for me. I entered the track of political analysis because, you know, there are two tracks, human rights and political analysis. And I started to study the unrecognized states. And semester by semester, I realized that there's a lot of things that humanitarian organizations do in this kind of states. And I decided to work on the topic, which is called the international humanitarian law, which is basically also can be considered as public policy, but not in the governmental sphere, but the public policy in the humanitarian sphere on the international level. And luckily, on my second year in the higher school of economics, I managed to find the vacancy in the Moscow office of Doctors Without Borders, and I joined after, I guess, like 4 or 5 stages of interviews. I joined the organization in the position of the editor translator. And it's been already 3 years since I work here, and I've been promoted recently, and right now I work as a communication officer. What I do, I mainly work with digital stuff like social media. I do translations, I do editing, and I mostly work with any type of content that we can work with. Why we do that? Because MSF basically provides care to the people affected by some crisis. And we tell about that because we want to attract attention of the world to the forgotten crisis or to the crisis that is going on for ages without any attention. So the next thing I'd like to tell about the relevance for this program to my work.
And you have 1.5 minutes left. Sorry to interrupt. So just be brief.
I will try to cut it short. Studying on the public policy department gave me an opportunity and the background and the necessary skills related and applicable for the work in the national humanitarian sphere, because you study in the international environment, you do a lot of things connected to the topics and connected to the job you're going to do at the humanitarian organization. You get the track of the political analysis and the public policy, which in the background of all their conflicts, of all their typical problems in this sphere. And this is very important for working in the humanitarian organization. Personally, for me, the value of this program is very huge, and I don't think that I could enter the job of MSF in MSF without the knowledge and the skills that I got from the public policy department and political analysis. And I think this is it.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And let me invite another graduate, Maria Yastrebova, who looks at you from this a lot of greenery behind, because she is currently in Kenya in UNDP office. So Masha, please.
Yes, so hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this perfect meeting in the morning. Yes, I'm reporting from Kenya, and I work as an Environment and Climate Change Associate Officer at UNDP. My career started from a very different background because I worked as I was trained as a teacher at Penn State University. And after entering HEC, I knew that I wanted to study education policy, but I also wanted to broaden my horizons and explore other subjects. And this program was the place to do that because it was not a study in depth, but it taught me to ask a lot of questions and also to find those answers for myself if I couldn't find them anywhere else. And one of the most important skills I acquired was probably, as Ekaterina already mentioned, mine is the same, an ability to analyze and synthesize information and present my ideas and present a convincing case, not just.
Marsh, you disappeared. So contact in Kenya might not be very stable. So let's wait a minute.
When I used to work in Uganda for 3 weeks, the internet was super bad, like the worst.
So you cannot connect in time?
Well, you can connect on time, but the bandwidth is very short, so you're not stable.
So shall we wait a little bit for Masha to connect back or move on to our last speaker, who's Yulia Gershenkova? Masha, are you back? Please turn your microphone. Please turn your earphones.
Yes, I'm sorry, my internet is very hectic. So yes, I was talking about the main skill that I acquired. It was being able to analyze the information and present it in a very convincing way that helped me to transition to a position first as a researcher at the HEC and later first working for UNDP Belarus and now for UNDP in Kenya. And my work is primarily concerned with ideas because I come up with ideas, I frame them, I present them, and I find money to support my ideas. And the second part of my work is very, very practical, which is project management. When you find people to do the work for the project, then you monitor them, analyze the results, and so on and so forth. So I would say that if you want to enter this program to get real life skills like project management, that's not the place because the only place to get that is real world and real work. But if you want to get the idea of how the world works, and if you want to get the idea of how different organizations function, how can you enter such organizations? How can you be a good specialist and a good employee? That's the place, and also a place to get to know a lot of great people because I'm still talking to some of my classmates, and now finally we're on the same continent with them, so hopefully we'd meet. If not, still I feel very supported by them from different parts of the world, even right now. Thank you. That's all for me.
Yeah, thank you, Masha. Now I see we have Yulia Gershenkova, who has 3 important parts of the career. She worked in TASS news agency. She worked at UNCHR, the High Commissioner Representative of Refugees, and currently working in ILO. So Yulia, with all this rich, pack of experiences, could you explain how did it all start for you?
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to such an interesting event today for prospective students. In addition to the other graduates, I'd like to speak about my experience. I obtained a bachelor's degree also at the HEC, which was in Asian and African studies. So I studied Arabic, which helped me a lot then during my career course. Then I joined the master's program in public policy, where I chose human rights track. So since then, all my career has also been focused around human rights and international relations. After I graduated, I started working as an international news journalist at the Russian news agency TASS. There I wrote news stories, mainly translating them from different foreign sources. So again, the skills that I acquired during the master's program of collecting information, verifying big amounts of information and summarizing it was very helpful for me. And later I decided that journalism was not my cup of tea. So I decided to change radically my career path. So I applied for an internship at the UN Regional Commission in Bangkok. I can just share a small tip with future students, if you're looking for internships in international organizations, you should be aware that they are only available when you are studying or 1 year after you graduated. So don't waste your time and look for them right after you started your studies. And after I came back from Bangkok, by the way, I was also working on migration, which was back then my research topic at the university, both at bachelor and master's programs. So I came back to Moscow and I applied to a position at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, United Nations Refugee Agency. And I got accepted and I worked as a United Nations national volunteer. Worked directly with refugees. So again, it helped me that I knew Arabic because quite a lot of refugees are coming from Syria. So I was talking to them directly, and language skills were key in that position. But in addition to that, I also had an experience before that of volunteering. Because when I was a student, I volunteered for a Russian NGO where I taught Russian language to refugee and migrant children. So if you're looking for some kind of opportunities, it's not necessary that they are somewhere, far away abroad. You can also find them somewhere at the local level, which are close to you. And then after 2.5 years of working at UNHCR, I recently got a job at ILO and I moved to Rome, where I'm currently based. Now I'm working on sustainable business practices. So I'm dealing with how can business, affect human rights and how can they respect the international labor standards in their operations. And again, at the moment I'm doing a research, so on corporate social responsibility practices of Italian enterprises, and the skills that I obtained during the master's program on how to build up a research design, how to create, how to approach the methodology, how to collect data, how to create questionnaires, and et cetera, helped me a lot with that. Again, the Italian language knowledge that I acquired when I was here during the double degree program at the University of Bologna was very important for me, because now I need to communicate, with business associations, with the authorities at the local level. So most of them, they speak Italian and they don't speak English. So yeah, again, the language knowledge was very important at that position. And I just want to say thank you. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thanks a lot. Our 5 best representatives of the 5 fields in which we have our joint careers. We still have about 11 minutes to ask questions, first to the general program and to the speakers, to the students. So let us open up for questionnaires, because at 12 we would have Caroline Шлауфер to have her lecture on what is public policy. So before we invite Caroline, there's still some time to ask questions. So please. Arina, if you watch people raising hands or that they're signaling that they have a question, please invite them.
Yes, okay.
Deep silence. So that was probably too much of information to focus on questions, but you can reserve them for later. And if you feel more comfortable, you can ask questions in Russian.
Nina Yurovna, I have a question. Can you please tell what time usually classes start?
Well, very good question. We are called daytime programs, so that's a full time. And this is why we encourage students to, if they engage in the work, to make an agreement with their job givers, with their employers, that they would allow you to study, because the first year often starts with 3. So that's the second part of the day, and many of our students manage to combine the work in one of the organizations and then the studies. But, second part of the year, there's a mostly courses starting from 6, ending 9, so that the people can, again, combine their practical experience with the institute they find and with their studies. And sometimes if you're late and if you have a deficit, so that you inform your professor, given that important reasoning. And so usually that is being recognized. But what is important, so that all students would understand that working with the group is important. So it's not just the presence in class, which itself is very interesting and important, but engage in group work with the other students. This is something that is measured, and this is something which is graded. So usually in the grading formula, there would be 20, sometimes 30 points, 30% that, or no less than 10% of your classwork. So this is something that you really should keep in mind if you want to have high grade. I hope I responded to your question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So students, prospective students, which country do you want to work after you finish? So we have a lot of variety of opportunities for you. Okay, let's see.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I also wanted to ask I have a question for one of the speakers. It's further, I wanted to ask you, maybe I misheard something, but I want to ask you what your work is about in the Moscow government on the transportation. I know I heard you said that you work on My Street program, but what skills did you get from the program which you use in your daily work today, and what is your daily work today is? Thank you.
This is to Fyodor, right?
Yes.
This is directly to you, please.
Well, let me start from the second part. My work is a coordination of the creation of transportation plans. So for the My Street program, we create transportation plans, and I coordinate this process. And one of the most important part of my work is to accord the final plan with other stakeholders, other Moscow departments, Moscow government departments, local deputies, local authorities, other organizations. And probably it's the hardest part of my work. And as for the first part of your question, I would like to say that conflict management course is a crucial for my work, and it's one of my favorite courses, and one of the most useful for my current job. Also, I would like to say that the skills to present and to concise information is really important in my work.
Okay, we still have time for for 1 or 2 more questions. So use your chance, please. You can also ask me about the general rules of the program and how it works, but you also can speak to our graduates. I see the square of, Anna Vozhedomskaya, Kirill Kuzhishov. So you mostly, listen to us without switching your cameras. This is much better to see your faces, and we can have, real collective discussion.
I wanted to make you feel more comfortable.
Please.
Seeing my face.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna ask a question. Could you describe differences between the 2 tracks a little bit more deeply?
Mm-hmm. Now, how much they
and so also sorry for interrupting, the learning process is kind of similar to international relations program. Can you also say what are the differences between political science, like your program on political science and international relations program?
Okay, let me start with the second one. Yes, there are many programs that are going to work, close to each other and overlap in certain things. And we try to make use of that overlap, inviting experts from the kind of neighboring topics to kind of co-teach with us. But the difference is really strong. So at international relations, they work on relations between governments, and they are making the foreign policy decisions and discussion about how does the global trends between governments are being relating. So we don't look at the relation between governments of countries. What we look at is domestic and international policy making. So regardless of kind of which country you choose, there'll always be some joint problems like pollution, like drug traffic, like human traffic, so that we focus on processes and we focus on issues, because as I mentioned from the beginning, it's a problem-solving exercise, so decisions in public interest. And so this is, less focused on the foreign states and their foreign policies, rather than on issues that the whole humanity is struggling with, like waste management, like refugee crisis, like general well-being or support to the disabled people and the programs of International Organization of Migration. So the major difference is the policy issue. So, and the policy is a decision that is made in a certain way, as I tried to portray in the beginning, is with participation of the informed public. So then what was the first question? So the division between tracks. Yes, this is basically kind of two different programs blended into one, and blended in the way that many of this knowledge in between those two courses, between these two specializations, between two tracks are close, but the difference is distinct. So if you look at the courses that I started in the beginning, is that the 4 courses are taught to both tracks. So they all know the general things of what is public policy, that methodology and research methods and contemporary political science, but at half of the courses that are general are devoted to the skills management, like global actors in public policy or conflict analysis. And during this division of tracks, the students make a decision where do we really want to work, because there's a lot of job openings with humanitarian human rights organizations. And this is why many of our students opt for the track on human rights and democratic governance, because it has the word governance is there. So for many students, this is a very attractive thing. And those who choose political policy analysis, they are from the beginning kind of very clearly interested, like in migration policy or in health policy or in education policy. So this is basically the difference. How do you want to join that field of public policy and political analysis? And I also look at the watch now, it's 1 minute to 12. Do we have Caroline Шлауфер?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, Caroline is here. So I want to be as strict to the time as you teach us, so that it's exactly 12, and this is when your lecture begins. So why don't we kind of move out the floor to Professor Шлауфер, who is from Bern University from Switzerland. Please, Caroline, the word is yours.
Thanks a lot, Nina. You already introduced me a little bit. I actually wanted to do that myself. So my name is Caroline Шлауфер. I am not from Bern University, because I'm from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, where I've been working for 3.5 years now. I am originally from Switzerland, and I have my PhD from Bern University. But yeah, I have been working here now for the last 3.5 years. Yeah. let me quickly tell you a little bit about myself, very short, just to explain you why I ended up in public policy. I have undergraduate education in international relations and history from the universities of Geneva and London. And then I worked for many years in different NGOs in several countries, in Switzerland, but also in Ukraine or Moldova. And while working in NGOs, one question that always bothered me a little bit was, what do we achieve with the work we do? So what are the results of our work in the NGOs? And this question bothered me more and more. So I decided to start working again at university in the field of evaluation. Because when we do evaluations, we ask exactly the question of what have we achieved? How effective are our programs? And I started doing many evaluations, first for NGOs, but then also for government. And I ended up in the field of policy evaluation. And in this field, I did then my PhD and ended up becoming a professor of public policy. So today I wanted to tell you a little bit more about what is public policy. It's kind of an introductory lecture. I teach that here because sorry, my voice is a little bit. I teach this here at the Winter School because in the program I teach the course Foundations of Public Policy, where you learn about the basics of public policy. In addition to this, I teach parts of the research seminar for first-year students and parts of the lecture on comparative social policy. When I teach, I usually try to do this very interactively. I try to let students discuss, and I want you to ask questions and give comments, but this is a little bit more difficult in this online scheme. But still, today, if you have questions, type them in the chat, or you can also ask them just like that while I speak. Then I can kind of I answer the questions right away. I will also make once in a while a stop to ask whether you have questions. So I have prepared some slides. I will share them on the screen, and I will start about what is public policy. So you should be able to see my slides now. I'll just also open the chat. Yeah. So if you have questions, type them in the chat or just wave or say something. Okay. Yeah, I have a few objectives for you today. After this 45 minutes, I want you, first of all, to become interested in public policy. I assume that you already are. If not, you wouldn't be here. But I want to make you a little bit more curious about our master in public policy. Of course, I also want you to learn something already. First of all, I want you to know afterwards a bit better what public policy is. I will talk about a thing called the policy cycle. So at the end, you might actually know what this policy cycle is. I want to talk a little bit about a few policy instruments. And if we have time, about policy evaluation, and would like you to learn about policy evaluation criteria. But I'm not sure whether we will have the time for that. Let's see. To start with, I have selected a few headlines from the news from the last year that contain the word policy. And I would like to show you these headlines and to discuss also what type of questions we ask in public policy. So we have a few headlines. For example, Australian Prime Minister dumps key climate policy. So as a public policy scholar, I right away have a few questions in my mind that I would find interesting about this. First of all, if he dumps the climate policy, there's a change. So policy changes. And much in public policy is about why is there a change in policy? Why does it policy not change as well? Because often we have a policy that stays stable for a long time and we wonder why. So a next headline is Russia's climate policy among the world's worst, study says. That might be true, but as a scholar, I would first want to know actually what is a bad policy. If they say it's a world's worst policy, what would then be a good policy? So what is a good policy and what is a bad policy? And as an evaluator, I would like to know, how can I measure that? How can I find out whether a policy is good or bad? So how can I measure whether a policy is good? And then there's this headline, public opinion can play a positive role in policy making. This is a headline from England. I'm not sure whether this is true everywhere, but again, here I would wonder, well, does public opinion really influence policy? And what are maybe other factors that can influence policy? I have a next slide with 2 more headlines, or maybe 3 more headlines. 2 more headlines. Here is the headline, energy is the biggest policy failure I've ever seen. Often in public policy, we see that public policy is actually not as good as it's supposed to be. And we will see often policy failure. So first of all is what is a policy failure, but also what are the reasons for this policy failure? So these are things we analyze. And then I have a very recent one, US to rejoin the Paris Agreement as Biden announces policy changes. So again, of course, is why is there a policy change? Why is a new policy adopted? Here, of course, the easy answer is that, well, there is a new president, there will be a new policy. It's not always as easy as that. Sometimes we have new presidents and they would like to change policy, but they cannot, or they do not. Why is that the case? One of my specific interests is also how policymakers communicate about policy. So I would also wonder about how did Biden announce that? What did he say? What was his speech like? This is something I'm very interested in. So how do policymakers communicate about policy? So you see, we have a lot of questions that concern current policy making, also current politics. And that is, in my view, what makes public policy and this master program also so very interesting, because it's about what is going on in the world at the moment. In the next step, let's look a little bit into the term public policy. Let's define it. And to start with, I would like to look at definitions by public policy scholars of how they defined public policy. And I start with a very old one. It's by John Dewey, political philosopher, political scientist, and he wrote in the 1920s that public policy is concerned with the public and its problems. Now here, in this definition, we have a little bit the problem that we use this word public, right? I'm also always interested in where the words come from, and just the word public comes originally from Latin, publicus. I'm not sure whether I pronounce it right. And this term generates usually some type of mass population in association with a common interest. So it's many people and they have a common interest. This is the term public. So a public problem concerns a problem that is of general interest, and public policy therefore is concerned with solving these public problems. As Nina Jureman usually says, it's a collective problem solving. So how does the general population solve their problems. So I have another definition. It's a little bit newer, but still older. It comes from the 70s, and it's by Thomas Dye, also a very important public policy scholar. And he says that public policy is concerned with what governments do, why they do it, and what difference it makes. It's a definition I like very much, because it already shows what actor is involved. This definition says that public policy is concerned about what governments do. So it includes only government as an actor. I like the definition because it asks for the why question. Why do governments do something? Or maybe also sometimes the better question is why they don't do something. And it has this evaluative question in it. As we remember, I come from policy evaluation, so I want to know what are the effects? What difference does it make? So what can governments actually change? I have a third definition that is a little bit newer, but also comes from the 70s, and it is much more detailed than the other two. It says that public policy is concerned with interrelated decisions taken by political actors concerning the selection of goals and the means of achieving them. Here, the Willem Jenkins includes more actors than government, because public policy, depending on which country we're in, is not only made by governments. We might have other actors, he calls them political actors, that can design and decide upon public policies. So this is the first difference. It includes more actors. It also shows that public policy can be messy, because it shows about interrelated decisions. So it's not just one actor taking one decision, but it's several actors taking several decisions, and they're interrelated. So public policy processes are usually complex. And important in this definition, it talks about the selection of goals and how to achieve them. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but as a short summary, public policy is about solving a public problem. And to solve a public problem, we first need to define a goal. Usually the goal is solving the problem. We have air pollution as a problem, and our goal would be to reduce air pollution. So this is the goal, which is usually connected to the problem. But then it's a lot about how do we achieve this goal? What are the means or instruments to achieve this goal? And when we talk about the policy cycle, we will talk about these different instruments as well. I will go on a little bit before we might make a short break for questions. We look now a bit more at the term public, well, public policy as a definition. I now want to talk a little bit more about the term policy. It is not from Latin, it is from the Greek word, ta politika. I don't speak Greek, so I have no idea how to pronounce it. It means affairs of state. So again, we have this connection to the government, to the state. Now, I speak, more or less, speak 4 languages. English, Russian, German is my mother tongue, and I speak French. And we have this word, politique or politica. And in English, we can translate this word with 3 different terms. Or put differently, the concept politica in English is not just one word, it's several words. It's the word politics, polity, and policy. And yeah, we're concerned about policy in a public policy master, which does not mean that we can forget about the other ones. In other languages is one word, but it helps a little bit to understand where our focus is. I will quickly talk about what these three terms define. Politics is all about processes. When we analyze politics, what a lot of political scientists do, they look at processes of different actors. For example, elections. If you do election studies, it's a lot about politics. How do politicians do their campaigns? How do politicians negotiate among each others? There's a lot of studies about parties, about how party politics happen. So it's a lot about these processes of actors. And then we have this term polity. It's not used as much, but it is used sometimes in English, and it means something stable, a structure. Sometimes it's actually almost used as a synonym for regime. You can, for example, say in a democratic polity, meaning in a democratic regime. So it's something like an institution that is stable, that doesn't change a lot. And then we have our word, policy. In policy, we look at the content. For example, what goals do we have in education policy? And how do we achieve it? How do we solve these public problems, like environmental pollution, like unemployment, and so on? Now, I kind of separated these terms, but they are all interconnected. There's a connection between them, and in public policy, we actually often look at this collection. I make a few examples. We, for example, look at how politics can influence policy. Just some examples. So lobbyists that bargain and negotiate and influence politicians, they can influence, in this example, health policy. So if lobbyists paid by pharma companies through a political process, lobbying is seen as a political process, influence health policy, so the content of a policy. We can also, here it looks a little bit negative. Lobbyists and pharma companies sounds a little bit negative, but we can also put that a little bit more positively. We can look at how an environmental NGO through advocacy influences environmental policy. So how do actors influence policy? Can also look at other political events. So policy can change after big political events. For example, elections, which is a political event. America, a new government comes to power, a new parliament through these elections, so policy can change. There can be also other changes in government. For example, in Italy, not through elections, just had recently, yesterday, a change in government. Haven't really followed the news. I'm not sure whether there is already a new government. Or protests, which is also a political event, may or may not lead to changes in policy. So here we have a little bit a connection between these political processes and policy, so the content. And I will look now also a little bit about the relationship between polity and policy. So also polity, so the structure of a political system can influence policy. For example, we have two different types of systems, let's say a democratic system and an authoritarian system, and we can see how does that influence policy. In my example here, I have policies in the field of digitalization that might differ. Maybe authoritarian governments might be more advanced in digitalization because they are maybe less concerned about privacy concerns than in democracies. Or we have a constitutionally secured institution of the central bank that is supposed to be independent. So here we have a structure, an independent central bank, and whether a central bank is independent or not, so how this structure is actually designed, can influence economic policy. Just also for clarification reasons, we have used the term policy with different other words. We use a policy field, policy issue, policy measure. Just to clarify, when we talk about a policy field or a policy sector, we mean the topic, such as health policy, education policy, economic policy, foreign policy. Often they're connected in a state to a ministry, not always, but often. And then when we talk about the policy issue, it goes a little bit deeper down. For example, inside health policy, we might have the issue of COVID-19, we might have the issue of tobacco control, and then we have a specific policy measure or policy instrument or policy tool, where I will talk a little bit more about it in a bit, is what instrument the states actually use to achieve a goal. So I have here examples. So the policy field would be health policy. A specific policy issue is how to control COVID-19 health-wise. And policy measures could be lockdowns, could be different information campaigns, or could be financial aid to businesses that had to shut down. So I think I will quickly ask whether there are questions so far before we then look at the topic of the policy cycle. So does somebody have a question? You can just say it or you can type it in the chat. And if you're shy about English, you can ask the question in Russian and I will just answer it in English. So I assume this means that you do not have questions. In these cases, I usually don't know whether I'm really clear about everything or whether you're just shy, but there will be more moments for questions. Okay, so now I want to talk to with you about a thing called the policy cycle. The policy cycle is a model of the policy making process. So we're looking now a little bit more into how is policy made. That's how the policy cycle looks like. It is originally was designed by a political scientist called Harold Lasswell in the 50s, but it looked different at the time. There were several scholars that kind of took it up and changed it. And today we came up with a policy cycle of 5 stages. So this model looks at policy making as a process of 5 interrelated stages. We will look at each of these stages now. And the idea is that we make one cycle, but it does not end. At the end of the cycle, well, we usually start with agenda setting. When we're at evaluation, we feel that there is still a public problem and we enter a new cycle. Those who designed the policy cycle had a very positive view of policy making and had the idea that with each cycle, policymakers learn and policies become better and better and more problems are being solved. I think whether this is the case is a point of discussion. Okay, let's look at first at all these strange terms such as agenda setting. So we start usually the cycle with up here with agenda setting. And this simply means that problems come to the agenda of governments. We will discuss a bit more in detail how this is done, what exactly is the agenda. In the next step, so we identify problems, and it is decided that these problems are important, that governments need to solve them. Then we need to formulate policies to solve these problems. So here in this policy formulation stage, several options are formulated. What could be done to solve the problem? And then a decision is made about which policy is adopted, or maybe the government decides that nothing is done. That might also be a decision. So governments adopt a course of action or of non-action. In the next step, these policies that the government decided about needs to be put into effect. Often we have the situation that the government decides upon a policy, but then nothing is done, where the problem lies actually in implementation. So either there's not sufficient money for implementation, there's not sufficient personnel for implementation, or the public administration that is supposed to implement it simply doesn't care. So there are several reasons for this. Once policy is implemented, or maybe already before, we should actually monitor the process of this policy and evaluate it, whether this policy has some results. So whether the problem that was identified in agenda setting was actually solved. So I want to go now through the cycle, through each of these steps, because they're all interesting in by itself, and give a little bit more information about these steps and some thought for thinking maybe also. So let's start with agenda setting. So more precisely, the agenda setting process decides what issues are considered public problems and are put on the agenda of policymakers. I always think of the agenda as such as a to-do list of the government, right? You have to imagine that there are too many problems around, then governments can solve. There is poverty, there is environmental pollution, there are many social problems, there might be instability, yeah, you name it. And governments will not be able to address all problems. They might try. So it is a question of what problems are actually put on the agenda and what not. And here I think something is important is that this, what problem is the most urgent problem, this is not necessarily an objective process. It is decided politically. So it is not an objective judgment whether some policymakers say, okay, for us, unemployment is more important than environmental pollution. In the corona crisis, there is a lot of discussion of what should we deal with more urgently, the health crisis or the economic crisis? And is there a conflict between the goal of saving as many lives as possible and having economic growth? Or is there maybe the option of putting both objectives into one optimum, achieve the least possible dead people with the least possible economic decline? So it's these type of questions that are decided, yeah, politically, through negotiation, also through a moral judgment. What is more important? Where do we put our priorities? I want to give you an example of what I mean, and it's the example of crime rates or immigration rates. Immigration or crime are often defined as a problem. Now, there are studies that show that politicians define these two things as a problem independent of the actual crime or immigration rate. For example, with crime in Western Europe, crime has been declining in the last, I think, 50 years every year. But there are many political parties that talk about the huge crime rate, even though crime overall is declining. The same can be true for immigration. When President Trump had his first election campaign, not the one now, but the one back in 2016 or 15, he talked a lot about immigration and about how immigrants from Mexico across the border. At that time, immigration was getting smaller and smaller, not bigger and bigger. So it is a lot about the political definition of what is decided to be a problem and what not. Another question is, who puts actually these issues on the agenda of governments? Well, often it's the government themselves, because they can make their own to-do list, right? I have here two examples from the COVID-19 crisis that governments decide, okay, now it's time, now the problem has gotten so urgent that we decide upon measures. But maybe it was not the governments themselves that put it on the agenda. There might be international organizations, for example, playing a role. I just put here as the example the WHO, the World Health Organization, that might play a role, now not anymore that much, but maybe in the beginning of pointing to the problem of COVID. It might be other groups, doctors, that say, we have a problem in the hospital, so please do something. I have another example from environmental policy, two different places, Russia and Sweden, where actually citizens say through protests that they see a problem in environmental policy. So it's the example of waste management in Russia and of climate change, where through a lot of collective action, such as protests, governments became more aware of a problem and started putting this on their to-do list. Okay, so this was it for agenda setting. We have now identified a public problem. We have put it on the list of the governments. Now we need to address the problem. And this is done in policy formulation. So in policy formulation, policies are identified. Depending on the political system, different groups can be involved in that process. I come from a very democratic system where we have what we call a pre-parliamentary process, where different organizations, interest groups, regions are consulted about policies, and they can just provide their comments before the parliament actually discusses and adopts a law, which then would be the decision-making process. I know there are other political systems that are a little bit more closed, where only governmental actors are involved in policy formulation. I will look now not so much into the policy formulation process, but I want to talk what policy measures exist actually. What can a government do to address a problem? What are the instruments a government have at its hand? So policy formulation means to identify and assess possible solutions to the policy problem, as I said. And we will look now more at policy instruments, that are the different strategies of governments to solve the problem. And basically, the government has 3 types of instruments, which are called carrots, sticks, or sermons. This is spoken in pictures to remember it better. So with the carrots, this comes from this carrot that you can put in front of the donkey, that the donkey runs faster. So it's an incentive. So carrots, we mean usually incentives, economic incentives. So financial instruments. You can subsidize things, you can give finance to achieve your goals. Sticks, it's the other way of getting the donkey running, it's by hitting it, right? It will also run fast. With sticks, we mean regulative instruments. So these are all instruments where government decides this is now a law, and if you do not adhere to the law, you will be punished, either through fines or through prison. So these we call regulative instruments. And then we have sermons. So sermons as in a church, where you can stand in front of the donkey and say, please, donkey, go faster. So it's information-based instruments through campaigns, through telling people what to do. I want to look now into all these 3 types of instruments, financial, regulative, and information-based instruments, and provide you with a few examples related to the COVID crisis. Maybe I have also other examples, I cannot remember. And we start right away with these information-based instruments. We go backwards. So yeah, COVID crisis. So in Russia, information-based instruments are used a lot. I realized that since I live here, everywhere the government tells you what to do. If you ride in the metro, they tell you that you have to hold your child by the hands, that everything is all the time. You have, if you pay attention, you will see that there's a lot of posters to tell you what you should do. And of course, the COVID crisis is a very good example for this, that everywhere they tell you to wear masks, to stay at home, to inform you to wash your hands, and so on. Now, when we look at regulative instruments, we mean, as I said, that we look at regulations that are prescribed by the government. So by prescription, we mean that they are mandatory, that you have to follow them, that you have some type of consequences if you do not follow them. There can be different rules, there can be prohibitions, also positive, there can be permits or licenses for something. I have just an example from the COVID crisis. The first degree by the Moscow mayor was in the 5th of March, 2020. It has been updated now all the time, where, for example, shops, schools, restaurants, museums closed, where started to have to need to wear masks in public transport. It was a little bit later in an update. So it's through a legal degree. This can be at different levels. Here it's by the executive, so by the Moscow mayor, but it could also be at the level of parliament through a law. Let's look at financial instruments. Here it's important to mention that they can be positive or negative. Positive is when you receive money, and negative is when you have to pay money. So subsidies can be grants, but they can also be subsidized loans or tax exemptions, so you do not have to pay taxes. And negative are usually taxes. Now, usually the objective of taxes is to raise money for the states, to pay for all the good public policy programs that the state has. But taxes can also have a purpose to discourage undesired behavior. Often a state taxes things that the state doesn't want people to do. Smoking, cigarettes are not so expensive just to produce them, but the biggest price is taxes. So you put a lot of taxes on cigarettes or on alcohol or on environmentally bad products so that people do not use them as much, to make them more expensive. I think I have also an example of financial instruments in the COVID crisis. So there was a lot of tax exemptions for companies. So they didn't have to pay in Russia, they didn't have to pay the social taxes during the lockdown. And they had the possibility, at least on paper, to apply for loans without interest rates. And here on this, we see also that they were supposed to receive some subsidies. So in other countries, we had a thing called short-term allowances for workers. It's to when businesses had to close down, that the companies did not put their workers on the streets, make them unemployed. The government paid a part of their salaries. So these are typical financial instruments. I see now that I'm like really running out of time. I've been talking and talking, and we are only in the policy formulation stage. Quickly want to talk about decision making. In decision making, the government approves one or more of these policy solutions. The problem with decision making as a researcher is a little bit that it is very difficult to look what is happening in a decision making process. So this is supposed to be a black box where we do not see inside. It's not the Čorný kvadrat by Malevich. As a researcher, it's difficult sometimes to understand why this decision has been taken and not another one. In the implementation process, these solutions are put into practice. And for example, we have different information campaigns that are conducted. So before we decided upon them, and now they have to be actually conducted. So you have to stick the posters up and so on. And you have to enforce it. So for example, the mask regime has to be enforced in Moscow. Yes, I think I'm running out of time. I leave the evaluation process out. Just quickly want to say what an evaluation is. So an evaluation assesses whether a policy has some results, and it does so by using social science methodology. In the COVID crisis, there have been already a lot of evaluations that measure whether these state instruments are actually effective or not. So maybe just quickly to sum up, well, if you became interested now, I will talk about that in the lectures, in the first lectures of Foundation of Public Policy class. So you just need to come and see in our master program. I want to talk a little bit about public policy as a discipline. What is interesting for me is that it's a young discipline and that it is interdisciplinary. We have in our department political scientists, we have lawyers, we have sociologists, and this makes it very, very interesting. So I hope that I can see you all in our master program. If you have questions, of course, you can still ask them because I still have 1 minute to reply to them. I'm not so used to having such a short lecture. I just realized I would actually usually talk a little bit longer about that. So, are there other political actors who are in charge of public policy except from the governments, parliaments, and presidents? Yes, there are. It depends a little bit on what stages of the policy cycle you look at. And it depends a little bit on what political system you look into. But other political actors, such as NGOs, such as advocacy groups, such as lobbyists, they can be involved in agenda setting by making awareness about a public problem. They can also present solutions. So in this policy formulation process, they can be involved. However, in decision-making not, because decision-making is usually done by the actor who has the authority to do that. Usually parliaments or presidents. And then in the implementation process, you also have, again, other actors involved. You have also in Russia, different NGOs that are actually involved in implementing state policy. For example, in the social sector, you have different social NGOs who are co-financed by the state and implement state policy. So I see Victor is already here, so I guess I'm not allowed to answer more questions. If you have more questions, you can ask them all to Victor. He knows everything. Or you can send me an email. I'm happy to answer all questions if there are questions. Thanks. Nina, if you want to talk, you have to turn on the microphone. Yeah.
I want to disturb you, but just about the question session, we may have a little time at the, after Victor, so that please reserve your questions that you can ask to all of the speakers that you've heard today. And now I introduce Victor Альберт, who will speak a little bit about himself and about what to teach, and what is your major topic for today is the citizen participation, environmental policy making. So please, Victor, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Nina, Caroline. My name is Victor Альберт. I'm a member of the faculty of public policy. I'm Australian, from Melbourne, and I've done most of my research on Brazil over the past whatever it is. Many years, I don't know, 13 years or 15 years, but I've been in Russia now for the past 4 or 5 years, and my general interests are in urban policy, around citizen participation, especially citizen participation, urban policy. I also have an interest in and done research on environmental policy and regulation and so on. So a few different areas there in it. In the public policy department, I teach a subject on regulation and reform, and I also teach a subject on urban policy in the BRIC countries, as well as some other lectures on comparative social policy. I also teach in the research seminar and qualitative research methods. Generally, I'm a qualitative researcher. Today I'm going to talk about environmental citizen participation in environmental decision making. So I'll just share my slides here. Okay, so I'll just go to the beginning here. Sorry, just skip somehow. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about citizen participation in environmental decision making. It's obviously a really important topic at the moment. The environment has become a really vital, not only area of policy research, but a major social and political issue, because there are a range of environmental problems that have emerged over the past 20 to 30 years, which have required increased government attention. It's required increased research on how to make good environmental policy. And there's quite a few criticisms of policy when it's made exclusively by the state or state-based actors. So I'm going to be talking about some of the critiques of state-based policymaking, some of the approaches to increase citizen participation in environmental policymaking, And also I'll look at a case study from Brazil of environmental participation in policy making to give you an idea of some of the ways that people participate in environmental decision making, environmental policy, some of the benefits of that, and some of the risks of some of the risks that are generated when decision making tends to occur in sort of closed government circles that are often influenced by business. So I'll start with a little image here, and this is sorry, I'll just talk just very quickly about the content. So I'll talk very briefly about a new survey that was out this morning. I thought that I would mention. We'll look at the role of the state in allowing for, but also restricting environmental regulations. We'll explore the rise of what's called the environmental state. We'll look at how environmental regulations diffused across the globe and some of the reasons and drivers of this diffusion, because as Caroline mentioned in her presentation, just as public policy is a pretty young discipline, environmental policy is also very young. And we'll look at how that sort of flowed across the globe very briefly. We'll consider the need for citizen participation and how they emerge in comparative studies of environmental politics. And as I mentioned, we'll have a look at a case study of environmental decision making in Brazil. So lastly, we might, if we've got time, we might run out, but lastly, we might consider get your thoughts on citizen participation in environmental decision making, but we'll see how we go. So I know that we don't have a lot of time today. So this is, I thought I'd start off with this. This is a group called Extinction Protest, and they've got this symbol of like an hourglass. You can see it in the sort of right-hand side there. They've got a symbol of an hourglass, which is meant to be sort of a symbol of time that's running out. It actually emerged out of academics. So the academics are often criticised for never being active, but this was actually initiated by academics in London, and it's since spread around the world a little bit. They're generally considered a quite radical group. They advocate protests and so on. But a survey came out today. I just looked this up, and I thought I would include this to suggest that these sorts of goals by groups like the Extinction Rebellion are shared by an increasingly large proportion of the world's population. So that the largest ever survey came out just today, I think, or was it, maybe it was yesterday? It was the 20. Yeah, I think it came out yesterday. So this was published yesterday, called by the United Nations Development Program, called the People's Climate Vote. So it surveyed 1.2 million people in 50 countries. So if you've ever had to do a survey, that's an awful lot of people. Around 60% believe that climate change is a global emergency. So a majority of people surveyed believe that it's a global emergency, and that includes 65% in Russia. So even in countries that are fossil fuel exporters, so there's perhaps a general expectation that in countries that rely on fossil fuel exports, like Russia relies on gas, like Australia relies on coal, uranium and others, that they would be less supportive of climate action. But this survey suggests that that's not the case, and 51% also strongly support renewable energy in Russia. So it seems that there's quite a broad-based support for action on climate change, which is a very important area of environmental policy making. And the report also found that young people tend to be more concerned than older respondents. So the young seem to have stronger commitments to addressing the climate emergency. And it also suggests that there's a large social mandate. So the area of environmental policy this suggests is not going to shrink in the years ahead. It's going to become increasingly important. And some of there are quite a few reasons for the way that the human environment has been sidelined in a lot of not only policy but political science, political sociology. We've tended to view the environment as kind of resources, right? Resources and value. So trees have got a value, the sea's got a value for the fish that it can provide, and so on. And this kind of perspective of the natural world as kind of something that humans can use has tended to ignore how the environment is vital for our survival, how oxygen, how clean air, how clean water, and also environmental biodiversity are really important. Okay, so for example, even something like a particular insect or a bee, so a bee can be really important for food production systems. Okay, so we're beginning to see how all of these, well, it's beginning to be recognized rather than we're beginning to see, but it's beginning to be increasingly recognized in policy circles how different elements of our biophysical support system are integrated. Okay, so one thing tends to affect the other. So there's a bit of a culture shift in terms of the way that the environment is viewed, and a lot of these challenges are yet to be addressed. So there's the report there if you want to have a look and read for it yourself. These slides will also be distributed later, so you can look at those. So the interesting thing here is that it's not just protesters of the government, of government inaction about climate action. It's actually been recognised in environmental research for a very long time that the state and even the liberal state will tend to significantly restrict environmental regulation. So what I mean there is that liberal states and governments will tend to avoid drastic forms of environmental regulation. Okay, so this is a general understanding or assumption in the literature that we see regularly. Okay, so for example, Boutel, who was a commentator, observes that we can expect the state to supply a basic level of environmental regulation that is, and these are my italics, compatible with sustained economic growth. So the key here is that the expectation is that the state will be susceptible to some kind of regulation, but regulation that is compatible with sustained economic growth. And a lot of the criticisms of environmental regulation have said that actually we've got a contradiction here. Okay, so with sustained economic growth, we know that sustained economic growth requires resources. It requires energy. So, for example, if you look at the course of developing societies, so societies that become increasingly industrialized, increases of energy consumption generally tend to track alongside development and economic growth. Okay, so there are these contradictions with sustained economic growth and in the negative environmental effects of that growth. So these kinds of contradictions have been worked out, and there are lots of different theories. One of them is like ecological modernization that argue that there are different ways that we need to reconfigure our economic system in order to reduce the environmental impacts of that. But anyway, so the observation here is that environmental regulation will be resisted by the state, or radical or serious kinds of environmental regulation. And Dreisek and Nehemiah, so these are two scholars that have also looked a lot about liberal states and about particularly citizen deliberation and deliberative democracy, have also criticized states for restricting access to environmental social movements, to environmental decision and policy making processes. Okay, so Patel says that we can expect states to kind of resist strong environmental regulations. Dreisek and Nehemiah have argued that liberal states will tend to restrict access to decision-making spheres to environmental social movements and other kinds of actors that argue for environmental conservation. So this means that the ability to confront some of the contradictions between sustained economic growth and the need to address environmental concerns, we face real challenges in terms of the structures, the decision-making structures that we have, which tend to be heavily influenced by lobbyists, by advocacy groups, by powerful advocacy groups, and by political actors that are related to them. So what are some of the other problems that we see with the liberal state and with the kind of liberal environmental state? So mostly I'll talk today about the liberal states, even though a lot of this will also apply to other kinds of states. So some of the problems with environmental policy making in liberal state and liberal democratic state is that with electoral politics, there tends to be a focus on short-term gains over long-term gains. Okay, so politicians are typically looking at the next electoral cycle, or maybe the electoral cycle after that, rather than 20 years or 50 years into the future. Okay, so the cycle of electoral politics tends to focus people's attention on short-term issues. Okay, so the next, what can win them office, what can maintain them in office. So this might be jobs, even if those jobs are not compatible with, let's say, biodiversity or the health of the environment. So secondly, public administration in liberal states and its command and control organization. So that means the top-down organization of power, the kind of chain of command that exists in the public administration, has been criticized for its adaptability to complex ecological systems and also its imperviousness to citizens and stakeholders. So I mentioned this earlier. So imperviousness means its resistance to input from citizens and stakeholders like environmental social movements. And environmental social movements and also citizens are really important because often they're the ones that feel the effects of environmental problems. So people that live, for example, we've seen here in Moscow, people that live around, let's say, waste recycling centers, they will be the ones that bring the problems up, that publicize the problems, and that seek to have some kind of change in policy. So thirdly, the state has been criticized because it's got diminishing relevance due to the rise of governance. Okay, so governance here refers to changes to the structure of government that has made the functioning of government more complex. Okay, so this is the general understanding of what used to be called the business of government to include other actors like NGOs, like international organizations, like lobbying groups, like advocacy groups, like citizen groups, like think tanks, and so on. So the general understanding that it's become more distributed, the responsibilities and business of governance has been distributed. However, recent trends, particularly in recent years, have challenged this. And we see this particularly in the COVID-19 pandemic. And also there's been a rise of nationalist populism. People like Trump, even in Australia, has become more populist and so on. So there are some examples. So what are some examples of super or transnational environmental governance? These could be things like the Paris agreements or the Kyoto agreements on climate change. And there are a range of other international NGOs such as Greenpeace, such as World Wildlife Fund, that tend to act on the international stage to affect policy making in different states. So what are the basic contents of the environmental state? So we can think of the environmental state as simply like a bundle of laws and regulations that manage society and nature relations. So these include things like waste disposal, where does your waste go? How is it processed? Resource extraction, how resources are extracted from the earth and used in different productive processes. Construction as well that use various materials, and also transport can be considered as well. So the different safety regulations around construction and transport. There's also so there's a system of environmental regulation. There's also an administrative apparatus. So these are generally ministries or special government agencies and parliamentary committees with special authority. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit how this emerged in recent years. So there's a body of governmental organisations that have emerged over the past 50 years or so that manage the relationships between society and nature and business. So these can sort of institutionalize priorities to ensure that environmental goals are respected in different government functions and also by business and by citizens. They can help to develop professional networks based on environmental expertise. Okay, so these can be international as well. And they can develop sort of shared norms, they can share knowledge, they can share sort of best practices and that kind of thing as well. They also have a sort of socio-cultural influence. Okay, so states and their agencies can generate environmental ideas and values that are distributed by society. And sometimes these can contradict environmental ideas and values that exist even in other parts of government. Okay, so there can be these contradictions even within the same government. And lastly, environmental agencies and ministries can be part of contentious politics. Okay, so they can be targets of contestation. So in other words, protesters or citizens groups or environmental movements can target, for example, the Ministry of the Environment or environmental protection agencies. And they can also be sites where there's dialogue and exchange. So it's not always kind of contestation. It can be deliberation, dialogue, and so on. So where the state can be more receptive to citizen participation, and there's a whole body of research around deliberative democracy in environmental decision making. That's a very interesting area of research, and something that you could pursue in your master's thesis if you're interested in doing that. So what is a historical interpretation of this development? So one of the reasons why citizen participation in environmental decision making has been so challenging, and one of the reasons why even sort of supposedly liberal states have been resistant to the participation of different actors in environmental decision making, is that environmental policy was added on to existing institutional foundations of the state. Okay, so the states were, long before they were involved in developing environmental policy, they were developed as with the aim of securing and regulating commercial activity and providing security. Okay, so these basic functions of the state tended to water down some of the environmental protection content. So we come to the relevance of protests and the typical complaints of the state and environmental policing as giving lip service to high levels of pollution, let's say, or negative effects of commercial activity, simply because states tended to be fundamentally about regulating and encouraging business, because states need that for economic growth, for the creation of jobs and production, and this tended to limit the reach of environmental policy making. And you can even see in the kind of hierarchy of environmental ministries. So the most important ministries are generally Treasury, the most important ministries are kind of business development, and then environmental ministry tends to have a less of a status in government. Of course, this is a generalization, and it might differ somewhat between different states. So here's the thing: even though environmental ministries and so on are relatively new, the state has always managed and intervened in nature. Okay, so nature is all around us. So state policy and activity always involved intervening in nature. But it was only in the late 60s that environmental bodies actually started to emerge. So the first was in Sweden in 1967. And quickly after them, we saw environmental ministries emerge and become standard features of most liberal states in post-industrial societies. In the 1950s, sort of clean air and clean water and air legislation was first introduced, requiring water and air that doesn't negatively affect us. We all know that in big cities, this particularly air, but also water can be a big problem. But by the 1990s, they were established in all OECD countries. So what happened in the second half of the 20th century was that there was a very quick adoption of environmental departments in OECD countries. It quickly became standard. So what accounts for this proliferation? So they're not all problem-based. A lot of them were responding to very specific problems. But for that, we have got to look at the interactions between states and mechanisms of diffusion over time and space. Okay, so this touches on a little bit of what Caroline was talking about before. So there tended to be pioneer countries. So these are countries that first developed the policies, and then they coordinated influence through international organizations, and this tended to diffuse it around the world. So there tended to be what we call environmental leaders. So these typically were countries like Sweden, Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Singapore. These were leaders in having different kinds of environmental innovation. And also some of them were very good in encouraging citizen participation as well, particularly countries like Sweden. But also here at times, it was not simply about environmental policy. So some of these countries were at the forefront of technological innovation, particularly countries like Netherlands and Sweden. So these were countries that were developing environmental technology. And so they had vested commercial and business interests in promoting environmental policymaking, because they had technology which, for example, could reduce emissions of CO2 gases, which could, for example, make your house more insulated, so you would have lower energy output to heat the home and so on. But there are also benefits in terms of being a leader means that you avoid the adjustment costs. So one of the issues with responses to the climate change is that countries will likely have to adapt to some of this some of these new policies. So they'll have to adapt, and this will cost more later on because you've allowed these changes, these developments, which then have to be converted to more environmentally sound forms of policy. So it actually can avoid costly changes later on down the line. So different kinds of this regulatory uptake or this policy uptake is also pushed along by things like OECD environmental performance reviews. So here we'll look at how we can think about this comparatively. So we have national actors that can take this up. So they draw on the institutions, conventions, and also political demand. And so if it contradicts existing practices or priorities, then it has less chance of being adopted. So this is one of the reasons why that survey was interesting. So if it generally the expectation is if it contradicts, it has a less chance of being adopted. So we would expect to see, even in countries that have support for, let's say, responses to climate change, there would be administrative resistance to this. We can see in countries like Australia, in countries like Russia, there is resistance. There's also the important role of the international system. We've got large super local actors like World Bank, like UN Environmental Programme, and even NGOs like Greenpeace and WWF, that they can help to diffuse norms at times through tying them, particularly in the organizations like World Bank, can tie them to conditionality. So these are some of the more top-down ways. I mean, at least in terms of the World Bank, some of the top-down ways that environmental policy can be diffused. But they can also be responses to widely felt public concerns. Okay, so there can be these top-down ways in which environmental policy is made, but there can also be some bottom-up public ways in which these public concerns can be addressed. So there are all of these different ways that we can examine this comparatively. Okay, so we can look at through theories of nudging, look at personal and collective thresholds, and so on. And comparative studies tend to look at how institutionalization is taken up through things like networks, through things like existing institutions in different countries, and different factors which address how and why environmental policy is taken up by different actors. So one large cluster of this research looks at cross-national studies of environmental governance, and it particularly looks on the evolution of policymaking and instruments. And a subsection of this deals with civic engagement, so looks at the different ways in which citizen participation affects environmental policy and decision making. In a little bit, I'll talk about some examples of that. So the literature here on civic engagement is really diverse. And there are things like online citizen participation. So these are, let's say, the environmental protection agencies, such as in the United States, can ask for input from citizens on their opinions on different kinds of environmental changes. There can be forums where citizens get to voice their concerns. So these are the kind of more formalized arenas in which citizens can affect participation. There are also non-institutionalized fora, like, for example, that extinction group that I mentioned earlier. So they are more contentious. They tend to work less in these kind of formalized sectors. And this body of research examines how these different factors, and there's even things like citizen science. So, for example, environmental regulators. You can use things like your mobile phone to look at things like noise pollution, and you can submit that information to different environmental bodies to provide feedback and data. So there's a rise of citizen science. Is also an interesting field of study. There are also another cluster that looks at large, these sort of large cross-national patterns of environmental performance. These are the large end studies. And then there's a third that looks at natural resource management. So today we'll concentrate on that first one, on citizen engagement in environmental policy. And rather than just talking about it abstractly, we'll have a look at some examples, some really important examples of where environmental policy goes wrong, and also how some of the structures that I mentioned earlier that tend to restrict decision-making to a small number of groups can be really detrimental for the risks that we face, the different sorts of environmental and also social and commercial risks that we face when those sorts of decision-making structures are heavily restricted. So this, I'm not sure if any of you heard about this. Does any of you hear about this? This is a dam disaster in Brazil a couple of years ago. Did anyone hear about that? Are you with me? Yes, we've got. Oh, you haven't? Okay, no, okay. So this was, hang on, I'm clicking on the wrong place here. Let me go back. Yeah, so this was a place called, this was a dam called Brumadinho in a place called Minas Gerais in central Brazil. So you might think in a way, okay, this is a fairly localized disaster, but it's not really. It was run by a company called Vale, which is it's part owned Brazilian, but it's also half owned by international businesses, part of which is actually Australian. So even though it's local, it actually has these international dimensions as well. So this was in January in 2019, where the dam burst, and lives were lost. An entire village was destroyed as a result of this. And there was a couple of other. There was another disaster in the same year in Brazil as well. So dams pose really significant risks to communities that are downstream, and they are also so they provide their real risk, and they've been the subject of a lot of contention in Brazil. So I'll briefly talk about this, some of the specifics around dams in Brazil. So just as a quick history, so Brazil emerged from 21 years of authoritarian rule in 1985, to be specific. So there was an anti-dam movement. Okay, so these were movements that wanted to protect the environmental areas of particular communities in Brazil. Sometimes these were indigenous groups. Sometimes these just were concerned about the safety or the nature in the area. But there was a big demand for hydroelectric power in the 1990s. So this, combined with particular policy terms, meant that dam development was pursued, often via PPP. So these are public-private partnerships. So these were partnerships where government partnered with business. So what I'm not trying to make an argument here that dams are bad or that public-private partnerships are bad. I'm not making that argument, but what I'm saying is that there were particular risks associated with the way in which these dams were made. Okay, there are arguments you can make for dams, and especially for hydroelectric power, because it's generally considered to be a good renewable source of energy. But this is more just critically looking at some of the decision-making processes and how, if you exclude some social groups from decision-making, you can run into different kinds of risks. So how does the policy come in? So there were these National Environmental Council resolutions, sorry, where companies needed to have impact statements and summaries, and they would need to have environmental impact assessments. So to consider how the development of dams would impact different communities. So in this process, so environmental impact assessments is one dimension of which I talk a lot more in my reform and regulation section. They've got a long history and have an important role in regulatory decision making, particularly in Europe, but also in different parts of the world. So public participation was important for carrying out these assessments. So that the public was meant to be involved in the way that the government made these assessments of how these dams were going to affect the populations that lived in and around the dams. But the participation here was really variable. Sometimes it was very strong. They had high rates of participation. They had meaningful participation in the assessments. But sometimes the participation, it was very low. It wasn't promoted well. It didn't elicit the involvement that it needed to, and people and the importance of these assessments just wasn't made clear to the different people that lived around the dams. So a lot of the theoretical ways in which some of this kind of collective action is theorized draw on basic theoretical approaches to collective action. So this involved political opportunities. These are considered the sort of context, the political context in which they work. So are there these opportunities to participate and to influence action? These might be splits between elites or conjunctural opportunities, so particular moments in time where there's opportunities or the political context is susceptible, and also being relatively free from repression is also considered important to have opportunities. Also important are mobilizing structures, so organizational resources, human resources, and institutional and historical relationship with powerful actors. So how is this important to the case at hand? Mobilizing structures are really important. So if you don't have a mobilized collective group in society, it can be really difficult to get them to participate in things like environmental assessments of the kind that were carried out in Brazil. And that's also termed, as I'll mention in a moment, social capital. So what are the ties like between social groups? Sometimes it also can simply be a matter of size. Are there lots of people that can potentially participate? And also frames. So these are the discourses that are used. These can be equality, it could be preservation, it could be tradition. We want to preserve our environment and so on. So Franklin Rothman, who's somebody that's written on a lot of this collective action in Brazil as well, looks at these bonding and bridging relations. So these are the relationships that community groups have, and also how these community groups have these relationships that bridge their communities to other communities or to other sorts of political actors. He's saying these sorts of relationships in and among community groups are really vital in order to affect government decision making. So there were 5 dam communities in particular that we can consider here. These were all in this key state of Minas Gerais, which is, we can see there. I know that I'm running out of time, so I'll be very quick. And so 4 or 5 of them were successful in rejecting dam construction. So this looks at the reasons. Why were some communities effective in rejecting dam construction and the others weren't? So why was this? Why was this Imboki able to resist dam construction, whereas the others weren't? So this has been a subject of quite a lot of debate about how and why different dams are constructed, how and why are communities able to join together and to resist dam construction, or to have a significant influence in when and how they are constructed. And in this case, Franklin Rothman argued that the emergence of networks of activists, so they mobilized resources and they used public hearings as kind of openings or opportunities to challenge the kind of closed networks, the closed decision-making that has been typical of the liberal state that I began the seminar with. So they use these public hearings as ways of publicizing their concerns. And they use their cultural frames, such as kind of a loss of habitat and so on, that challenge the plans of the developers. So Mbolki was the only one that was unsuccessful. But this had to do with kind of quite strategic and tactical reasons. So they signed on landowners very early, before the hearings were heard and before anyone could attend. Okay, so and this caused a division. So some of the landholders wanted to sell to the dam makers, and it caused these divisions in and among community groups. So whereas in the other instances, the communities were able to band together more collectively, here the way in which the developers signed communities on early created these divisions, okay? And this prevented the mobilization of community resources. So we now know that developments like this had significant effects, such as the Brumadinho and Mariana disasters have proven. So these are just a couple of the reasons. These were just a couple of the cases of environmental decision making and some bad outcomes of when this decision making was made in sort of more closed decision making spaces. So that's about it for today. I think my time is up, if I'm correct. Is that correct, Nina? Shall I pass it over to you now? I think your microphone is muted. Nina,
Sorry, I know. Thank you, Victor. Usually because it's a time before the break, so there might be, we can use another 5 minutes for questions to you and Caroline. So let's, if Alina, you do not object to that, can we spend another 5-10 minutes for questions?
Sure, I'm happy to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there is one question in the chat. It was for Caroline. Are there any other political actors who are in charge of public policy except from the governments, parliaments, and presidents?
Mm-hmm. Caroline, you're with us?
Yes, I am, but I've already answered to this question, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question. I have a question. This is for Sir Victor. Yes, it's about the climate change. You know, do you think the nature has something to do with the climate change? Like, is climate change a natural phenomenon?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, thanks for the question, Joseph. Well, first of all, I would say I'm not a climate scientist. So I study policy and policy responses. So I defer to climate scientists on these on questions like that. They know better than me. I do say that I believe I think I follow the science, and if the scientists say this is real, it's happening. I mean, I will tell you my understanding. So yes, of course, there's always climate change. We understand that there are basic cyclical patterns in the climate change. These are affected by all kinds of things like El Nino, all kinds of things. But what's happened is that climate scientists have isolated aggressive changes to the Earth's temperature and have convincingly attributed these changes to the levels of CO2 emissions. So of course there is always climate change, but this extreme increase in recent years has been identified by climate scientists as attributable to high levels of CO2 emissions that we've seen in recent years. So yes, I defer to them, but that's my understanding of the answer.
So probably we have one more question. before the break? So there was a lot of information the students have to digest, so that if you get, the questions that you really want to follow up on, you can write to Alina and she would distribute it to us. And that's how we can continue the dialogue. Alina, you have any announcements currently about the group work or about the second part of the day?
Well, we'll wait everyone back at 3 p.m. So now we have a break. No other announcements required.
Could you take this, the question of how many students still stay to the end? Because we had quite a limited number of them this year, and it's interesting how much they're really passionate to participate and stay with us. Is there a number you can give us, how many students were listening to our presentation today?
Well, yeah, I will send you the list of the students who were at all of the lectures, but I could say that majority of people who were with us from the beginning, so around 20 people, so all of them stayed with us till the end, which is great. And there were also people who joined us later, like Joseph Paulo Edding, for example. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. So is the first part of the working day of the winter school is over. Now we have a break, right? And after the break, we have 2 more presentations on the masterclass of Harry Potter and human rights. And I urge you to be on time because Dmitry is an excellent speaker and you would learn a lot about human rights through a different perspective. And then we have a final presentation, which is surfing pandemic waves between collective security and individual freedoms. And we hope that this would broaden your vision and get you more information of what our scholars, the member of departments are working on. So shall we say goodbye for now?
Yeah, okay, thank you everyone. See you back at 3 p.m. Now you can switch off and then just go back for the same link.
Victor, Caroline, my very deep appreciation of the contributions you've made today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Автоклик, картинки.